God's Word, turn to the chapter that we read, leaving our studies in Colossians to one side this evening. We'll pick up the thread again if we're spared when I back. But I'd like to look with you this evening at Ephesians chapter 5. We'll read at verse 25, although my interest is in the second half of the verse. Husbands, love your wives, even as Christ, and then we have these words, also loved the church and gave himself for it. As Christ loved the church and gave himself for it. Well, you'll have noticed in our reading that the apostle here in the closing section of the epistle is applying the theology that he's taught them to their practical daily relationships. He deals husbands and wives where that applies. In the next chapter, he deals with children and parents. Then he deals with servants and masters. We might call that employers and employees. And in this section where he's dealing with the husband and the wife, the apostle makes the point. It's not a novel or new point. It's one that comes up again and again in Scripture, of course, that human relationship is an illustration for us and is governed by a higher bond of Christ and the church. Christ as the bridegroom, the church as the bride. And indeed, we're told in verse 24 that the church's submissive attitude to Christ's lordship is to be reflected in the male headship of the husband as well. Then we're told in verse 25 that Christ's love for the church is to be reflected in the husband's love for the wife. So Christ's headship is seen in the relationship, and Christ's love is also seen in this relationship. And as he deals with that, he expands on it, and he goes into a slight aside, if you like, for a couple of verses, because he begins to speak about the relationship between Christ and the church. He loved the church, he gave himself for it. I'll come back to that in a second. But then he goes on to tell us more. There's two that's, there's three that's actually, one after another. He loved himself, he loved the church, he gave himself for it. Why? Why? Well, the first that is in verse 26, that he might sanctify it and cleanse it, because he finds it in an unclean, sinful condition. But he loves it, and his love extends to this cleansing work of the Lord. And how is it to be done? With the washing of water by the Word. The Word as the great instrument in calling them to himself, and the great instrument of sanctification once they have come to himself. So that's the first that. He loved it, and he desires to cleanse it, to sanctify it, to purify it. But that's not the end, because then we have another that in verse 27, that he might present it to himself, a glorious church, not having spot nor wrinkle or any such thing. What efforts people go to in this world to have no spots, no wrinkles and any such thing. But you know, as we get older, spots and wrinkles become more apparent. Well, as the church goes on in glory, when they are presented to Christ, doesn't matter how long they'll be there, there'll be no wrinkles, no spots, not any such thing. Just in case there's anything else that we can think of. No, any such thing. And then there's another that. But that it should be holy and without blemish. This is the great end of Christ's love, the great end of Christ's work, that his people should be holy and without blemish. like himself, reflecting himself, made like him. But we better go back to verse 25. Christ loved the church and he gave himself for it. Well, I'm just going to take these 2 points one after another, and there's no reason to complicate the verse. We're told that Christ loved the church. Now, why doesn't it say that he loves the church? Because that surely is true. He loves the church. But that's not what it says. It says love. Now, sometimes when we would use that word like that, we might think it's just in the past tense. He loved the church at some past point. But no, the wording here is very precise. It's pointing us to the nature of this love and to its eternal nature, to its ongoing, unbroken, unchanged nature. It's the same as when Paul says in Galatians 2, the Son of God who loved me and gave himself for me. It's not any thought that he loved him but he stopped loving him, or he loves him less than he loved him then. Not at all. It is an ongoing love that we are dealing with here. He's taking us here really to the borders of eternity itself. He's taking us into eternity past, when he loved his church. You will never find a point at which he didn't. And it's taking us into eternity future. This ongoing love of the church. This unbroken, unchanging love for the church. It doesn't get any greater because it can't get any greater. But it doesn't get any less either. There is no cooling of this love. Now, this is all, of course, a great mystery, that Christ loved the church. We understand why he might love the angels and those of them that kept their first estate. We can accept that and understand it. It's natural. But why he would love the church, considering the condition he finds them in, and we sang about that in Psalm 113. He from the dust doth raise the poor, that very low doth lie, and from the dunghill lifts a man oppressed with poverty. That he may highly him advance, of course. Why would he love such creatures? Well, we don't know. We can't go behind it. It can't be explained or rationalized to our poor minds. But that love itself is the fountainhead from which all God's redeeming work flows. From that great fountainhead. Now, although much of this is mystery, and there are things that we can't grasp and explain and analyze in any great depth, although much of it is mysterious and is hidden from our understanding, we do know certain things about this love. I'm just going to list 5, and I've touched on 1 or 2 of them already, but it doesn't matter. I want to list them separately. First of all, he loved the church eternally. He loved the church eternally. I've touched on that already. The Father gave the church to Christ before the foundation of the world. He loved the church eternally. What great security that is. His love is not something that appeared yesterday or at some point in history or at some definable point. But he has always loved his people, always loved his church. Before they were, before they existed, never mind before they were saved, before they existed, before their parents and their grandparents existed, before the world was, he loved the church and was always determined to do what was best for the church. We can't just grasp that. We can't love somebody who isn't here. We can't love somebody who isn't born. It's just concept defeats us. Doesn't defeat them. I have manifested thy name to the men that thou gavest me out of the world. Thine they were, and thou gavest them me, and they have kept thy word. Well, he loved the church eternally, but he also loved the church infinitely. Infinitely. It's beyond measure. We might put love for somebody on a scale. I might say, well, how much do you love that person? On a scale of 1 to 10. And they might say 9, they might say 10. Well, there is no scale when we come to the love of Christ for his people. There is no scale. It is immeasurable. If I were to ask you what the biggest number is that you can think of, well, you might say 1,000,000,000,000,000. Well, multiply that by itself and keep on going. There's no end to infinity. There's no end to the love of Christ. It's just infinite. It's eternal and it's infinite. We'll never reach the borders of it. We'll never reach a point where we can say, yes, I see it all now. I've got it all. I've got all of this love of Christ for his people. I've got it now and I can see the corners and the borders. Never. No matter how much you learn, there's more and more and more. It's like the African woman, isn't it, who saw the sea for the first time. It's just come back into my head a long time ago. I think it was an old lady in what was then Rhodesia. Somebody connected with Free Presbyterian mission work there, and she somehow ended up being taken to the sea, and she was living in a landlocked area, of course, but somehow she saw the ocean for the first time. And somebody asked her, what was it like? Oh, she said it was like the love of Christ, always coming towards me, and yet at the same time, on the other side, I couldn't see the end of it. The ocean of infinite love. He loved his church eternally. He loved his church infinitely. And he loved his church perfectly. Perfectly. Yes. Well, there's no perfect love in this world. But the Bible speaks of a perfect love. It tells us that perfect love casts out fear. And this is a perfect love. He loved his church perfectly. There is no shortcoming in his love for the church. He loved it perfectly. So everything he does for the church is perfect. And it's done in loving perfection and in perfect loving. He loves his church perfectly. Fourthly, he loves his church collectively. He loves that body that is his church. He loves it in its unity. He loves it in its togetherness. He loves it in the way that he has brought it together and made it one. And he delights in that. And he finds satisfaction in that. And he finds a peculiar satisfaction even in gatherings such as we have here. What we have here is like a mini, how can I put it? It's like a mini reflection of the whole body, the whole church, all believers in Christ, down through the ages, from every race and creed and all the rest of it. They'll all be together in heaven at last. But here, on a Wednesday night, here we are, and it's like a little mini group of that. And he loves that togetherness. He loves to see his people together, to see them together singing his praises, to collectively uniting in prayer together with one another, and to reflect on these. He loves the wholeness of it. He loves his church collectively, but he also loves his church individually. As much as he loves the whole body, he loves each part of it. As much as he loves the holy city Jerusalem, as the church is compared, so he loves every stone and every brick in it. He loves them individually. And he loves them all with that infinite perfect love. Well, Christ loved the church. And then Paul says, he gave himself for it. Well, he's given many things to her. Given many things to her collectively. Given many things to her individually. All the good gifts of the ages, the blessings he gave Abel and Noah and Abraham and all the way down to yourself, Christian. The blessings you have, the blessings the church have. It's not because they're lucky. It's certainly not because they deserved it. It came from love. He has given many things to the church. But the emphasis here isn't on the things that he's given, but on his giving of himself. The greatest that he could give. God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son. This is that gift of God. He has given himself. Christ loved the church and he gave himself for it. Well, how did he give himself? Well, can I list a couple of things? First of all, he gave himself actively for the church. His love for the church wasn't just an emotional bond. You might have an emotional bond to somebody, but it might be maybe some relative or some friend that you had. And they're not here. They don't live in Skye. They don't even maybe live in the United Kingdom. And you have a certain emotional bond, and you like to hear from them, and if ever they came back to Skye, then you'd love to see them. But there's not much activity, really. You're not actively doing anything, and they're not actively doing anything for you. But this love that we have here, it's active. It's not just an emotional bond. He is active in it. He is unceasingly active. He's unceasingly active. He sacrificed himself on our behalf. No, we hear of people sacrificing themselves. And you say, that's a labor of love. Well, this is a labor of love. He sacrifices himself. We'll see to what extent in a moment. He is putting her concerns, in a sense, before his own interest. Now, I know I have to qualify that because his interests, he doesn't lose his glory in any way, but at the same time, he makes himself of no reputation. He puts our concerns actively before his own interests. Father, if it be possible, let this cup pass from me, Gethsemane. But it is not possible because he loves the church. And he must be active. He must be active in coming into the Word. He must be active in going to Calvary. And he is active at Calvary. He's not a passive victim. Never think that. I have power to lay it down, he says to Pilate. I have power to lay it down. And he exercised that power. He dismissed his spirit. He did something that none of us will do. He cuts the cord. He dismisses his spirit. He lays it down. He has been active from all eternity. And he's still active. The advocate with the Father. All the rest of it. He did it actively He gave himself actively. He gave himself voluntarily. He gave himself voluntarily. No man taketh it from me. He took our nature with the express purpose of offering it as a sacrifice for sin. There was no obligation, no coercion. No, you've heard me speak often enough about the way Professor Murray puts it. Helpfully, he speaks of God having chosen to save a people. Then the work of Christ became, as Murray puts it, a consequent absolute necessity, and we do believe that. There was no other way that they could be redeemed. But that is voluntary. The choice is voluntary. Once the choice is made, there are certain consequences, certainly. But, sometimes you'll agree to do something. Maybe this is a better way to read. Sometimes you'll agree to do something, and you think it's easy. And then you realize, actually, it's a lot more to this than I ever imagined, and actually I don't have the time or the energy or the ability to do it. Why did I ever agree to do this? If I'd known then what I know now, I wouldn't have said yes. There's nothing of that with him. He knew then what he knows now. He knew from all eternity what he knew on Calvary's cross. No doubt, as regards his human nature, there was a revealing of things gradually. We don't know that. But he has known from all eternity. He did it actively. He did it voluntarily. He did it totally. He gave himself totally. Not only did he give himself voluntarily and actively, but he gave himself totally. Well, who gives themselves totally? You give yourself 10%, 50%, 90% maybe. He gives himself totally. He gave himself up to humility, to being born in a low condition. He gave himself up to his sufferings, including his ministry, which was extraordinarily demanding. He gave himself up to temptations by the devil. He gave himself up to, I don't remember how Professor Finlayson put it. He gave himself up to being betrayed by Judas. I think Finlayson ties that in with the bitter herbs in the Passover, if my memory is right. He gave himself up to violence, gave himself up to death itself, to continuing under the power of death. He gave himself totally. He held nothing back. He doesn't just give his sufferings. He gives his blood. He doesn't just give his obedience. He gave himself without spot to God. He offers himself without spot to God in order that they might be without spot. He gave himself for it. He gave himself actively, voluntarily, totally. Fourthly, he gave himself penally, in the sense of giving himself to the penalty, to the pains and the terrors of divine condemnation. It pleased the Lord to bruise him, to crush him, and he is crushed. He became accused. He became anathema. He was made sin. The identification comes that close. He is made sin who knows no sin. The firstborn in the sacrifice in the Passover. The firstborn is here, and there is There is no passing over for him. In Egypt, the blood of the lamb was the shelter. But there's no shelter for him because his blood is the shelter. He gave himself actively, voluntarily, totally, penally. Fifthly, he gave himself substitutionally. He's talking about the firstborn, and well, that's what he was. He is the substitute. The wrath of God is against the Son. The Son of God is against sin, rather, and the Son placates that wrath. It falls on him, and how it falls in all its condemnatory, destructive power. What does every sin deserve? Every sin. Just one. Every sin deserves the wrath and curse of God, both in this world and in that which is to come. Deserves the pains of hell forever. That's just one. There's more than one. There's more than 1 trillion. There's a number that we can't comprehend. The debt is so high. Your debt is so high. Supposing there was just you. And there's a number that we can't number of believers. You just have to stop, don't you? Judgment of God. Paul. Where do we find the judgment of God most clearly? Oh, well, somebody might say it was in the Exodus and the plagues in Egypt, or in the destruction of Jerusalem, or in some terrible physical event. No, my friend, it was at Calvary. That's where you see the judgment of God. Unleashed. Divine justice must be satisfied. A holy God cannot simply admit a people into heaven with debt and sin. The soul that sins, it shall die, and the only way is a substitute in its place. That is acceptable. He takes his people's burden, and at Calvary on the cross, atonement is made. Augustus Toplady puts it like this, if I can get the words. Complete atonement thou hast made, and to the utmost thou hast paid whate'er thy people owed. How then can wrath on me take place, if sheltered in thy righteousness and sprinkled with thy blood? He gave himself actively, voluntarily, totally, penally, substitutionally. He gave himself undeservedly as well. There's the chief of sinners, and the Son of God has loved him and gave himself for him. There's Paul, and can say, I quoted already Galatians 2, the Son of God who loved me and gave himself for me. He wants to say me again and again. He loved me, gave himself for me. He doesn't confine him to some dark corner in heaven. No, he saves the chief of sinners, and he puts him in amongst the princes that we were singing about in Psalm 113. These are sinners who despised and rejected him, who broke his law and who had no time for it, who wasted his day and who scorned his word. They didn't deserve anything. Some of them were his sworn enemies, they all were really, but some to a particular extent. And yet he undertakes this work of reconciliation and he gives himself. What does Paul say to Philemon about Onesimus, the runaway slave? If he owes you anything, put it on my account. Yeah. If she owes you anything, and they do, put it on my account. And he does. He does. Ah, the love of Christ. This self-giving love. And we saw already the ultimate aim of all of this. And if you are spared next week, I won't be with you again until after the communion is proclaimed. But if you're spared next week, you will see that set out before you in the symbols of the broken body and the shed blood. And you will see the evidence in the gospel and its symbols in the sacrament of the one who loved the church and who gave himself for it. What security you have, Christian. You look up and down, but as Rutherford says, that the rock doesn't ebb and flow, just my sea. Your sea ebbs and flows. The rock remains the same. There's an island, it's not really an island, it's a little rock outcrop just out the back from Manse there, and water comes back and forth. Sometimes the water's around it, sometimes the water covers it actually, much to the consternation of nesting birds. Other times it's gone, it's back and forth. But the rocky outcrop is still there. The rock of ages doesn't move. It doesn't ebb and flow, just my sea, as Rutherford said. What security you have. Oh, you say, what else can I do? All the doing is done. He loved the church. He gave himself for it. And you're saying, oh, well, if only I knew I was included in that. Well, what does he say to you? He that cometh unto me, I will in no wise cast out. Take him at his word. Do you believe him? Oh, you say, of course I believe. Of course I believe. Well, you take him at his word. He is honoured when you take him at his word. Ah, you say, my unbelief, though. Ah, I know it. But you remember what the other man said. Lord, I believe. Help thou mine unbelief. It's the same with you. You think you're the only believer in the world troubled with these things. Oh, it is the common experience of the Lord's people. He loved the church. He gave himself for it. God bless his word to our hearts this evening. And we now sing, we'll pray together in conclusion in a minute, but we'll sing with us now.